we're at Corfe Castle to see something absolutely incredible. In the tower behind me, the Butavant Tower as it's known, is an oubliette. And inside this oubliette, a tiny little dungeon where people were simply forgotten, there was a group of medieval knights who were literally left to rot inside there. There was also a woman, a very noble woman, who was left to rot and die inside there. The oubliette as an execution method was terrifying, and it was also psychological torture. So join us today as we look at the stories of the oubliette of Corfe Castle. And as always, to support our channel, click subscribe down below. The reputation of the oubliette of Corfe Castle is one that is horrific, and it was a site where many people succumbed to their executions and deaths. The ruins in Dorset have been the place where a King of England was slaughtered on the orders of his stepmother. But the oubliette was a dungeon which was said to have been one of the worst execution methods in history, as a prisoner would be simply forgotten and left to rot inside. Some oubliettes were so horrific that a prisoner would be forced into a very cramped space, and they were fighting against rats and other horrific elements, including the remains of the previous person locked inside the dungeon. But inside this dungeon of Corfe Castle, there were 22 knights who were starved to death on the orders of the worst king that England ever had, King John. The oubliette could be found inside many different medieval castles across England and Europe. One of the worst was inside of Warwick Castle, and this was found deep underground in one of the towers on the edge of the fortification. It was so far underground that the screams of a prisoner would not be heard, and next to the oubliette was also found a torture dungeon. This dungeon was so feared that during the 100 Years' War, French soldiers heard and found out about its reputation, and they were incredibly scared to be taken prisoner at the hands of the English because of the Warwick oubliette. However, inside of Corfe Castle, this specific dungeon was found inside of a tower named the Butavant Tower. This was found next to the Great Hall, and part of it still exists today in its ruined form, and the large tower would have had steps down to the dungeon, which would have been kept under very close watch by guards. During the reign of King John, the shocking medieval king, John brutally put his enemies to the sword, and he was not afraid to deal with them in the most severe and brutal ways. He has been labelled as the worst king ever to reign over England, and he lost some of his power after he was forced to sign the Magna Carta, ceding to the demands of the barons who wanted to hold the lawless king answerable for his actions. King John also turned the sword on his own nephew Arthur, a man who many believed should have come onto the throne following the death of King Richard I, but John, Richard's brother, took the throne for himself. Around this time there was a growing Angevin Empire that involved a number of lands and settlements in France, such as Anjou and Brittany. But due to the War of Succession, John managed to strengthen his power, but in 1202 a number of people who supported Arthur, the Duke of Brittany, rose up and caused John a number of problems. Arthur was the son of Geoffrey, the son of King Henry II, and in the eyes of many he was a man who should have been the rightful king instead of John. But at the end of July 1202, King John discovered that his own mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was being besieged by the armies of Arthur in a castle at Mirabeau in France. He was concerned that her capture would cause John further issues and worry, but John was around 100 miles away when the siege took place. He was a few days away at the time, but the castle managed to hold out, and John then attacked the besiegers, and he then seized Arthur, his nephew, and the majority of Arthur's supporters. It was then reported that the English king had many of his enemy knights and supporters under his capture, and John then became notorious for the way he dealt with these prisoners. The knights that had been captured were sent to Normandy in shackles and chains. They were led through French towns and cities in disgrace, and one witness said that John kept his prisoners in a horrible manner and in abject confinement, that it seemed an indignity and a disgrace to all those with him who witnessed his cruelty. But Arthur himself was held in Normandy, but John had a huge amount of his supporters as prisoners, and John, as he had so many prisoners, then ordered for some to be sent to England back home to be held inside of castles in the south of England. The knights crossed the Channel, and the English king was in no mood to negotiate with the rebels, and he captured other cities, but after being forced back to Normandy, John had Arthur slaughtered. A number of knights and prisoners were then sent back to England, and specifically to Corfe Castle. On the 30th of January 1203, King John crafted a letter in which he told many of his trusted allies, including a man named Hugh de Neville, that he had a number of prisoners, specifically Warren de Caron and Maurice de Bausen, who were then to be held under lock and key at Corfe Castle. He then wrote to other custodians of castles, in which he told them to open their dungeons, ready for a number of knights who would be held there. There were 22 knights who were sent to Corfe Castle to be locked inside the Oubliette there, and the constable of the castle was ordered that he should do what Thomas, the clerk of our chamber, and Hugh de Neville will tell him on the king's behalf concerning the prisoners that had been delivered to him. On the orders of King John, these knights who were sent to Corfe Castle were to be subjected to torture ordeals and also execution. But then a later chronicler wrote specifically what happened to the knights of Corfe Castle. He wrote that 22 of the nobles and strongest in arms were starved to death in Corfe Castle, so that not one of them escaped. What in reality occurred to the knights was that these 22 soldiers were sent to the Oubliette of the Butavant Tower, and this would have been incredibly cramped inside of the dungeon. Whilst here they were given no food and no water, and within a week or two they would have all died inside the Oubliette of the Butavant Tower. Today this dungeon where the knights suffered is hidden behind an iron grate and a set of stairs, and the grate's been placed there to stop people seeing what remains of the dungeon following the damage to the site caused by Cromwell's forces following the English Civil War. Corfe Castle was selected by the notorious King John because it was close to the south coast and was very easy for his forces to transport the prisoners over from France. But also its location is very close to Swanage, a beach on the coast, meaning that the prisoners could have even landed on that specific beach from France. Then they were then taken through the hills on the short walk a number of miles to Corfe Castle. But John may have wanted to specifically punish these knights for fighting against him and siding with his enemies, but he gained a horrific reputation for this. King John became notorious for his brutality and barbarism against prisoners, but also against the people of his nation. He would tax his people cruelly to raise funds for a foreign war, and he was later forced to agree to the demands of his barons after he got involved in civil war against them. But he was a man who ordered the execution of prisoners of war and knights who had sided against him, and they were locked inside the Oubliette of Corfe. But they would not be the only victims of this specific dungeon, as later one of John's former allies turned against him, and the brutal king then had his wife starved and slaughtered inside of the Oubliette of Corfe Castle. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.